Clark Manus is the CEO of Heller Manus Architects in San Francisco. He'll also be the president of AIA, the national president in 2011. And he's here in Chicago to talk about East Coast, West Coast tall, which at first appearance is kind of comparing skyscraper typologies on the two coasts and here in the central part of the country, but really turns into a conversation of sustainability and livability. Let's talk just about the title of this, East Coast, West Coast tall. What is that and where are we going with that?
Well, the idea is really to try and look at what issues architects, engineers, and contractors are working on in various cities in the U.S. related to tall buildings and what the commonalities are, and whether it's skin or mechanical systems or structural systems. But what came out of the discussions and research that I did was really ultimately about green building policy and what those are, because you begin to see a consistency about the character of buildings in U.S. cities. We in the U.S. are clearly not at the heights that either China or the Far East or the Middle East is doing. And so the dialogue about what height is a little different. So it provides an opportunity for us to sort of take a closer look at what we're doing, particularly at a time now when we're on a pause on high-rise buildings being built and probably preparing ourselves for the next change, which clearly will change.
Well, when we talk about East Coast, West Coast, we're also talking about a timeline, because the buildings on the East Coast were built first and then they kind of slowly moved west to where you now have skyscrapers on both coasts, but certainly the ones out west are different than the ones out east. What have we learned in that timeline? What differences are there that are going to be brought into the future?
Well, the other thing is I didn't in any way, and this was just a coincidence on the title, didn't want to leave Chicago out because I think it does represent high-rise in a great American city. I mean, New York is clearly far denser, but Chicago really represents a confidence about height and really is the place where the skyscraper really started in terms of its architectural history. But it's, you look at the commonalities on skin expression, and one of the things that I talked about in my talk was about height. Which is really a very interesting dynamic, because Chicago tends to not fear the height. I mean, the spire was clearly, I was told, 500 feet taller than the Sears or Willis Tower. New York, latest decision on Tower of Array that Hines and Jean Nouvel did required them to take 200 feet off, and height for buildings in San Francisco that my firm's always involved in is a 1,000-foot building is a tall really tall building, and there's this desire to sort of shift where the height is, and it hasn't really happened for a long time. But when you talk about cities and the differences, you also talk about the height dynamic, which is, I think, a part of what high-rises are and why there really is a difference between the intent of what China or Asia and the Middle East is doing in terms of super tall buildings. I don't think that in the U.S. we would ever get to those points. It's just not part of our sensibility or part of what the public culture is. So when you look at East Coast, West Coast, it's really U.S. more than typically the coast. And the comparison that I also was looking at was what green building policy and sustainability means relative to high-rise buildings. And there is a difference between the intents in the U.S. in terms of what projects are striving to some level of sustainability based on where they're located.
You have spoken about sustainable building. Of course, a lot of the high-rises, super talls being designed in the world today are being designed here in Chicago. But Chicago is also a town of sustainability, and it's also one of the towns that's leading that. And one remark that you made that really got my attention was when you named the cities that are the leaders in the United States of sustainability, you said Chicago, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, and you mentioned, and it's something I'm not used to hearing, is mentioning Chicago in connection in the same breath as a bunch of West Coast cities.
I would say that Mayor Daley has done a remarkable job as a champion for that cause, whether it's simply green roofs or whether it's the aspiration to be more sustainable. I mean, if you look at the city, and that city's evolved the criteria, Chicago has been as intent as some of those other West Coast cities that I named because it's been focused on wanting to do that. And I think that comes from the top. That comes from a strong mayor who believes in it. His speech earlier today was really about why he believes it's important, why he believes that this city should strive to it. And it's a competition among cities. I mean, that's the best way to describe it. Everybody wants to be the best at it. I don't think that we're best or top ranked. I don't think that a U.S. city will be the city with the tallest building in the world, but we may be the ones who are championing the greatest level of sustainability. And Chicago is clearly in that conversation and dynamic.
Is it the Chicago typology as far as Supertalls that has found its way to the rest of the world? It would seem to be that way, as opposed to being more of a New York or a West Coast skyscraper. True?
Yeah, I would say that that's probably correct. I would think that my view is that the West Coast culture of height is such that Supertall is really not part of what people want.
Well, living in an earthquake zone's not helping either.
Yeah, well, there are ways to design buildings that are tall, that deal with seismic structural capability. But I agree with you. I mean, the cities that would entertain Supertall or taller or breaking height limits are clearly Chicago and New York. And Chicago has never feigned from that. It's always championed that. It's championed the skyscraper. The city footprint is big enough for those people who live in 1 or 2 story row houses or townhouses to not feel that it's a threat to that. Cities that are smaller or more compact, people tend to sort of feel that a super tall tower or tall tower is going to overwhelm their small community. So I think that Chicago in many ways has that advantage over many other cities in the U.S. which are really trying to champion height. And the sustainability, focus has really been one driven by the profession at large, but also being driven by a strong mayor who is intent to make a difference. And he's raised that dialogue and he's made it competitive. And I know my own city, San Francisco, is always trying to compete with, what Chicago is trying to do. And I think New York in that dialogue is just not as visible in terms of the conversation. That's why Portland, which is a much smaller city, has looked to livable communities, has looked to the confluence of housing and transportation and office and parks and things that people really understand in terms of living in a particular community versus big cities where they don't necessarily have the ability to affect those things.
Well, ultimately this conversation is about sustainability and about urban habitat. The Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat has been around for several decades.
40 years.
For quite a while, and really in the history of the organization, the conversation, as you've noted, has gone more from the tall buildings to the urban habitat. And I really get a sense this year that the urban habitat is starting to really get an equal footing. I mean, is that your feeling?
Yeah, that's really one of the things when I was asked to be a speaker here that really leapt out at me, that UH was really not a part of the intent that the council had been pushing, because it really been focused on engineers or architects or contractors or suppliers who are really focused on the building typology. And I think you're right that I think that the council is in a great position to be a part of a policy dialogue about urban habitat, about sustainability, about density in cities. I mean, that's really what people are seeking in this ultimately new era, which then is part of the conversation about what truly makes communities livable and healthy and avoids people driving their cars and having parks and access to great activities and places where people want to come and live. And being here for this conference, every time I come to Chicago, it's got that vibrancy, which is what people love about cities.
I'm going to get off the tall buildings for a moment. We'll get back to them because that's more your presentation, but getting more into the urban habitat. We've heard kind of all schools of thought here in these last few days of the conference about high density, some places where high density is a fact of life and sustainability is helping the quality of life there, and other places where they feel like decentralization and bringing back more of the native character and just the neighborhoods and the families and the social fabric that way are more important. And you've made the remark here that high density is the most green practice possible. Is there a conflict in views here, or do you see those as not being in conflict?
No, I don't see them as in conflict. I think that density is a broad word. I mean, you know, you can be in a small community and doing a 5-story building, you know, 1-story community is density. That's still a move up in cities like, you know, Chicago or San Francisco or Seattle or New York. Clearly, we're pushing to greater heights. I think the specific dynamic about high-rise buildings individually being some level of LEED certification and sustainability is only a part of the broader conversation about a community and a city being sustainable. And I think that's the important opportunity that the council has in the expertise that it has about what the building typology is and raising the conversation as it relates to cities, because it's in a unique position based on its depth of knowledge.
I've raised the point with other interviews that sometimes I feel like we're being pushed into cities. I don't know if that's an economic thing or a social desire on somebody's agenda, but we've all heard about the evils of sprawl, and yet we're hearing that decentralization is really the key to better life. Are we starting to reconcile that here, or get a feeling, or is it an individual situation for each place?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's an individual decision. I would say that, you know, sprawl's not evil. It's just not environmentally sustainable. And if you forget high rises and you forget, you know, the attribute of suburbs, distributing services, whether it's water or electricity or stuff like that, to remote and rural places is just, it's not a financially viable, if you look at it that way, it's not a financially viable thing. So density is a relative term. I think that not everybody wants to live in cities, but everybody wants to be in a place where they have access to common services, whether it's in a small suburban community that's got density in the core and there's a place where people gather. But I mean, I think that's an important part of the dynamic.
Two of the talking points that you raise here are, number one, elements of an iconic high-rise. There are a lot of high-rises out there, but not very many that are iconic, at least in a world's tallest situation, in a city-specific situation, certainly. But when you talk about the elements of an iconic high-rise and what comprises them, there are 5 points here. Structural building systems, which is an aspiration to net zero. The facade of the building, the typology and how it's being used, and I guess how it fits in with the urban habitat and the character of the urban habitat. What comments would you have on that?
I guess my sense is that just saying a building is iconic doesn't make it iconic. I mean, there's a great sort of marketing, PR, character about, you know, is my building iconic? Is it going to be identified as the icon? The thing that I continue to see is those skylines that are iconic, which is a composition of buildings, really is the thing that people notice. You know, they may notice an individual building, but that's a look at me kind of thing. And, you know, there's a difference between the building that's a sort of principal statement and part of the choir. And if you look at buildings like the Empire State Building or the Chrysler Building, they were really never seen as iconic at the time. They have evolved to be iconic because they are memorable and they've lasted the test of time and they've transcended that. And, you know, were the World Trade Towers iconic? Only in ultimately what happened as a result of 9/11, but probably not in their earlier stage where they were 2 extruded rectangular boxes to, you know, 110 stories. So you begin to look at what iconic is, and I think the conversation is more about iconic skylines. Chicago has one of those. San Francisco is evolving to one. New York has. I mean, you begin to look at what people remember about that city and remember about the imagery of it related to tall buildings. And the elements of it, which are very, very functional, you know, and as the technology has evolved in our ability to build taller buildings or create more efficient mechanical systems are really a sort of subset of what the iconic is, because it's really a part about the image of the building on the skyline, or the image as a part of a composition on the skyline.
I'm gonna go abstract on you here,
Okay.
so fasten your
Okay.
seatbelts. To tie this into the iconic high-rise and the theme of sustainability, I don't know how this question occurred to me, but does the definition of an iconic high-rise change with its level of sustainability?
You know, that's an interesting point, because everybody is desirous of seeing wind turbines or blades on the top tower of the building and stuff like that. And we haven't seen much of that. And you would think, to your point, that it would be able to be demonstrated visibly why a building is sustainable. But going back 30 or so years and watching the typology of high-rises be related to its orientation, whether it was east, north, south, or west, relative to solar gain and stuff like that, was something that we seem to have sort of lost track of in the effort, or in the sort of ramp up to material technology that has required us not to have to really worry about that. You know, glass skins are great insulators, but I would have to say that most buildings, the overwhelming number of buildings in the U.S. and probably even globally, don't manifest the description of the public saying, "Oh, I see the difference between a regular, quote, high-rise building, skyscraper, and one that is sustainable because it's got all these special features on it." And it'll be interesting to see whether that happens, but so far I don't think, at least I haven't seen ones that really manifest that as an example. They tend to be very similar.
Because I'm wondering if the wind turbine is somehow becoming iconic in this country. The only reason I say that is there are a lot of them in my part of the country, and I see them out driving around a lot. Iconic not in the sense of a skyscraper, but in an agenda or in a desire to be a little more self-sufficient. And I suppose that skyscrapers are ultimately kind of a culmination of hopes and aspirations. I suppose it's possible then that you could have some kind of neat gadget skyscraper, sustainable skyscraper that could become that.
Yeah, yeah, it could. But you know, because skyscrapers last for 50 to 100 years, you know that the technology changes. Like, we're so used to computers changing it's faster than every 18 months. The technology is going to advance faster than the ability to incorporate it. In one of the presentations about Burj Dubai and their need to sort of move the process forward, they couldn't incorporate those things because the technology was not there. So we're going to have to think about it differently. And the other example that I've read recently is the difference between replacing CFLs in your house and then versus the use of motion detectors. And that's one of those
CFLs?
Compact fluorescent light bulbs,
Okay.
which are the little,
of course, okay.
Right? And so everybody's desire to replace all those incandescent with CFLs is a desire to reduce the level of energy consumption. Buildings are doing that. But statistics seem to demonstrate now that the use of motion detectors, which basically turns the lights off, is this sort of background, like a demonstration of sustainability, far more than the sort of visual demonstration. So I think you're right. I mean, the iconic nature of sustainability, I think, is a fad. That's the best way I would describe it. It's a cool thing to be able to do, to say I'm the first one to do it. But I think that the danger is that you will use yesterday's technology by the time the building gets delivered, and 10 or 15 or 20 years later, it will not be seen as something, versus trying to be much more energy efficient and changing people's patterns as they get to work. And there's a whole series of things that are not obvious in terms of you identifying something that's more sustainable.
That's good. I know I was reaching on that one, but that came out pretty
good.
well.
No, I think it's important.
The issues that you've brought up that have affected the way high-rises are built and perceived and understood, and now we have some years here since 9/11 for a little bit of perspective about that. But but certainly that incident has changed the way that high-rises are perceived and built. It's certainly cut down on the height of one high-rise here in Chicago and has cost yet, at least one other 2,000-foot tall dream. And the economic conditions in the country right now, skyscrapers are so, it's one of the reasons they're rare is because they're a long gestating creation, and the world moves a lot faster than that. Are there other issues that have affected the high-rise and whether people think they're a good idea?
I go back to, I think you hit on something that, after 9/11, there was this cry that that's the end of the skyscraper. We'll never build any tall buildings anymore because of what happened with that. And time passed. We understood much better about what terrorism was about in our own country and as a single event. And it really hasn't thwarted skyscrapers. They're being built all over the world. Any of those events could occur in any other place in the world city. But I do think that the whole conversation about cities, about density, about sustainability is really a sort of part of the conversation about skyscrapers. It's real. They're all sort of tied together, and why we think it's important that cities provide the place for those to be versus out in the middle of a field, and hope that people will be drawn there irrespective of having transportation or any other services associated with it. And that's the challenge that other parts of the world are having, which is they're proposing projects in places that don't have the infrastructure. And I think as we have matured as a society, particularly in the U.S., we are now understanding why it's really important to have that infrastructure. And great American cities, Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and other cities, we know that the infrastructure is there, and therefore the development of skyscrapers in those locations is the most logical place to put it.
Unless you have other points you want to raise, I'd like to move along to the future here, and there are so many proposals for buildings of just incredible height as centerpieces of larger urban plans, and that I've made the observation this really looks and sounds like science fiction, but it's becoming science fact. What do you think of when you see these incredible renderings of future cities in other parts of the world and kilometer-tall buildings that they're actually starting to build today? What goes through your mind?
I've had the opportunity to listen into a couple of the sessions about those super tall buildings, and being a great fan of them, having done my share of them. I guess I'm getting to the point feeling that there is a limit, both in terms of economics and the character of a super tall tower. The ones that we see that are a meter, 1,000 meters tall. It just means that it changes the dynamic. You're basically building vertical cities versus ones that are sort of horizontal. And so I can't forecast this, but I think we're going to get to the point where we're going to say, not that we can't do it technologically, but I think in terms of social dynamics, I don't think it's going to happen. I think because the cost of building them and the sort of social equity which happens in our society is really not a corresponding thing. And I think those projects that have tried to do that are pursuing a particular niche market, which is really not necessarily representative of our, if you look at the U.S., of our population in terms of where people want to be. Some people are happy being in a 5-story building, some in a 30-story building, some in a 100-story building. But when you get beyond that, the costs drive it to a place where it's a very sort of narrow part of the population that's able to afford that.
You are an incoming president of AIA in 2011, and you are attending the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. So as the president of AIA, what is your mission going to be as far as kind of expanding on and assisting with some of the ideas that we've heard here?
The conference in Dubai that I attend because my firm is part of the council because of the building typology that we do has always been a great interest to me. So my role to be as AIA national president is really part of some of the things that I talked about in my discussion, in my speech, about livable communities. And I see that there's a real opportunity, both with the AIA, the Council on Tall Buildings, organizations like ULI, USGBC, to create a bigger dialogue about affecting public policy related to what I've just talked about, which is the logical allocation of transportation, land use, housing to, maximize our resources and be able to create cities that are vibrant, if we're going to be able to demonstrate that. And then the other part that I'm really very anxious, and the council's always had a very good profile, and this is expanded international presence. The council's always been there. I know the new chair's intent is to be able to expand that to Asia. My firm's work, growing work in China, is really part of that sort of dialogue, which I think is really important and sort of in the world stage. And so I hope to be part of affecting public policy. I hope to be creating even stronger alliances with organizations that I believe are part of the built environment, and the council is really a great technical resource and great sort of inspirational resource to what that means, and is involved both in the development and creation of existing cities and new cities and sustainability. And so I think that's really what I'm most excited about, is the opportunity to be able to help champion the ability for organizations to create livable communities and livable cities in a way perhaps that we've never done before. So, and it's tall order. I mean, I know it's tall order. I'm one individual involved in an organization, but at least I feel that I'm able to talk about some social issues and policy issues that I think that affect all of us.
Thank you for the conversation today. Really enjoyed it. Clark Manus is the CEO of Heller Manus Architects in San Francisco, the incoming AIA president in 2011, and our guest here at the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat 2009 conference in Chicago.